folks. Hello and welcome to another installment of the Napoleonic Wars channel. We are live all evening tonight, getting inside the mind of Napoleon. There's a lot of hubris out there. There are a lot of opinions on what Napoleon was like, his personality, his traits, but quite often a lot of that is mere hearsay. It's people with opinions, people who have never dug, people taking isolated quotes and making a lot of them. But what happens if you take a team of expert psychologists, pair them up with a leading historian of the period, and let the two make some sweet music? Well, that is the focus of this evening's talk. I am joined by the acclaimed historian, Professor Ed Coss, Emeritus Professor of History at the United States Command and General Staff College, and author of the very highly respected book, All for the King's Shilling. Published in 2010, it looks at the British soldier under Wellington during the Peninsular War, and is a book that every single time I've spoken to a veteran about, oh, we are having some minor technical issues, this is going to plague us over the course of the evening, there's not a lot we can do about it, folks, we ask for your patience. But as I was saying, every time I talk to a soldier about Ed's book, after they've read it, they always say, this guy understands what it's like to be inside the mind of a soldier. So if you haven't had a read of Ed's All for the King's Shilling already, I'm going to post a link to it in the chat over the course of the evening. As ever, a huge welcome to all of you. Welcome to Dave. Many thanks for the kind words about the reaction video, which really seems to take off. Hello also to Jean-Charles. Good to see you. Alan as well. Folks, remember to say hi to one another in the chat. Let people know where you're coming from, where you're joining us from this evening. And remember to whack that like button. It makes a big difference for the algorithm. It's going to take you 1 second. It's right underneath your screen. Push that like button, the thumbs up, and it will help me in terms of trying to widen the reach of the show. Ed, that was a very lengthy introduction. Very little of it was actually about you. Good to see you, my friend. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, and I hope indeed we can make some sweet music this afternoon.
Hey, that's always the plan, right? It's an interesting concept, this study that you did. It was published in a book edited by me. Full disclosure, folks, I am therefore biased because I wouldn't have published it if I thought it was absolute codswallop. So you'll get my stance on it, because if Ed had handed me something and I looked at it and thought this is complete nonsense and it doesn't make any sense and there's no historical basis for this and it's, rubbish, then I'd have turned around and told him to go away, which I clearly didn't do because it ended up being published. We'll also put a link to that book in the comments so that you can buy it if you are interested. But I want to talk about... Let's talk about you actually first, Ed, and your interest in this period. What is it that makes you tick when it comes to Napoleonic history? Because there is a kind of theme that runs through your work.
The neurophysiology and fear of the individual on the battlefield. I think as military historians, we give so little credence to that. I talk to a lot of young budding historians, and they want to talk about William H. McNeill, grandiose overview things like Pursuit of Power, but he wrote that at the end of his career, which is an overview. And I'll talk to them, but isn't it the essence for you to understand your period, to understand, because you're military historians, to understand what the key driving forces of the soldiers are in the battlefield. And you can really unlock some things. And I was fortunate to teach for 15 years at the Command and General Staff College. And if I had gotten anything wrong, the Rangers or the Special Forces guys, they would have informed me without question that, well, that would be good, sir, if only it were true.
Mm-hmm.
But
I imagine you might have got a slightly saltier response than that.
They were very polite. It would have been the command sergeant majors, which I ran into later, that would have used multisyllabic words that call into question my mother. They believe wholeheartedly that when the bullets fly, and there's the underlying thing, guys and gals don't fight for God or country or an ideal. They fight for the person next to them. And pulled me across, geez.
Yeah, we are going to have a problem all evening, but
all right, we'll just keep rolling.
Right. We'll keep rolling.
I think I had as many as 50 semesters, and they told me exactly the same thing without a dissenting voice. So that's why I started digging in. And then you find out things like the British method of, because it's all about survivability. That's what it's all about. And the British tactic of training these guys to hold fire, knowing that they weren't going to hit anything at 150 yards anyway with the brown bess, getting them to hold fire to 40 yards and then going to a bayonet charge. That unleashes that perspective. And it doesn't have to be a perception, it doesn't have to be reality. It just has to be perception in the mind of the soldier that his actions have efficacy. Even if they don't, but he believes they do, it releases a whole different array of hormones than if you're standing there at 175 yards, plinking away, and here come the French in the pas de charge. That's going to get a lot of reactive. It's going to get cortisol, a lot more cortisol, which is the biochemical for depression. So that's what got me into all this, to discover that unintentionally the British tactic, for example, had real efficacy on the neurophysiological side. So I try to use science as much as possible.
Yeah, one of the other really startling things that came out of your research that I drew upon, besides the primary group concept, and we might actually do a separate live stream on that, actually. It's a fascinating topic in and of itself. But the other thing that really stood out for me was when you looked at nutritional analysis. So you went and broke down what these guys were getting in terms of food day in, day out, and then compared that to the calories that they were burning. And those results were really startling.
I didn't know, and nobody had apparently ever done a micro and macronutritional analysis of the rations. And the key thing is to remember they didn't get them every day, or sometimes even every other day. And since there was such a, as you will know, and soon present in your book, there was such a disciplinary component of these guys stealing potatoes or anything. Even, of course, they end up doing it because you'll take the risk of a punishment over survival. So these guys, what were they asked to do? And then what were those caloric values of the pound of meat, half a pound of bread, whatever? No vegetables in the original rations, none of that. And you find out that on a good day, given, because with the numbers I drew up in the 7,500 man database, suddenly I had height, and then I was able to locate the body mass index. So we ran tables of height and body mass index all the way from like 19 to 22, and then you found out here's calorically what you would need for an individual of this age at this time, and you find out they're a third of a calorie, they're a third of a ration short every given day without exertion. And on some days, they're short 4 or 5 times, which means you lose a pound for every 3,600 calories. So they're losing 2 pounds a day easy, not including water loss, which nobody knew about hydration. So that, to me, told me, at least started guiding me, and that these guys are stealing because they're starving. They're not doing it because they're general mass inherent criminals. They're doing it because the army can't take care of them. And that starts opening up windows into their behavior.
It certainly does. We will resist the temptation to turn this into a crime and punishment discussion. Perhaps we'll save that for another day as well. You and I talking about the implications of this. Certainly for my own research, looking at how actually people just seem to not only turn a blind eye, but then go, actually, you know what, you're hungry. Go plunder. go get some food because I need you to fight tomorrow, kind of thing. But that's a whole other conversation. We'll save that for another time. Okay, to the focus of tonight's talk, then we're going to get inside the mind of Napoleon. But I want to be very careful about how we get into this, because there will be some dangers that we're going to talk about in just a second. Napoleon's dead. I'm sorry if that's a spoiler to anybody who's tuning in tonight, but he's been dead for a heck of a long time, and that creates a problem from a diagnostics perspective. And add to that the accusation that often gets thrown at historians when they present a piece of research that catches people by surprise, that you are being biased. You weren't looking for the evidence behind this. These are a couple of things that I've seen hurled your way, I think very unfairly, because you and I had many conversations as you were crafting this research. You were very careful about how you went about doing it. So I want to ask kind of what you went looking for in the first instance, because my sense was always that you weren't expecting the final analysis to actually drop out of this wider research. You had very different things in mind. And the obvious thing that people are going to talk about here is, well, surely Napoleon had PTSD. When you consider what he experienced over the course of your life, it would actually be quite surprising if he didn't experience some kind of stress as a result of the trauma that he would have seen. And obviously, sure, PTSD as a concept didn't exist back then, but that doesn't mean that the symptoms that we now associate with PTSD didn't manifest themselves in a variety of ways. So in terms of what you went looking for, what were your hopes, what were your aspirations, and what did you think that you would actually find?
We had nothing, and I say we because I should explain that. Over the course of multiple semesters, after the array of classes on Napoleon, Jomini, all these put together, there was always a psychologist. One of my students would come up and they would, just by garnering, and this is usually their first foray into Clausewitz or Napoleon, they go, Napoleon seems like he'd be an interesting guy to have, under observation, because he's exhibiting some, to them, those professional, you're going to call it instinct because it's just your subconscious. But for them, their professional experience, there was some things that were popping up that they'd like to explore. So I stay pretty close with my students. So after I heard this like 5 times in a row from 5 different semesters, I contacted them and said, would you be interested in examining? And the whole study was supposed to look at Napoleon and PTSD.
Oh, we have just lost the connection, folks. Apologies for this.
Right,
Ed will be back momentarily. So there we go.
Let's just keep rolling.
Yeah.
They didn't miss much, okay? But we decided, and I'd rather call it PTSS because it's a syndrome, a disorder sounds like a reaction that is not in line with the exigencies that caused it. It causes something egregiously different. To me, a syndrome is the opposite. It is, in fact, a behavior or a series of symptoms that align with the trauma that was faced. So if I slip into PTSD, I really mean PTSS. So we decided, 20 years of warfare. They saw 1 million French soldiers killed under his watch. He had a lot of reflective time on St. Helena. So let's go see if we can match up the criteria as listed in and I'll use this term a lot, the DSM-5, and I'm talking about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. It's from the American Psychiatric Association. It's their driven book that has all the agreed upon. It's how they do diagnoses. So we thought we'd line them up and we'd find something revealing and interesting. But that's not how it turned out at all.
an interesting results you did indeed get. Before we get to the intricacies of this, I want to talk about the dangers, and I kind of alluded to this a couple of minutes ago, didn't I? Because there is always that thing of, hang on, you're trying to assess a guy who's not on the couch in front of you. And there are plenty of psychologists who will turn around and go, that's a problem right there.
There are
You've also got, besides the ethical considerations, and there are arguments on both sides of this, quite obviously Napoleon can't consent to the release of this information, but is there actually a case to be made that you should release this information? You've also got potential research biases. You've got the huge dangers of what if it's done badly, and there has been some sort of pop psychology that's been done by historians who've just sort of gone, I've read sort of half a manual on this, and so I'm going to come to this particular opinion on a historical figure. So there's a lot of danger here. Just talk me through how you navigated that, because you were very careful and meticulous, I've got to say.
I'm not sure we have enough time. Okay, there's so many. As a historian, you find that anything novel, anything new, and you should be bringing up new stuff, because otherwise you're just a chronicler telling tales. But if you do things with brand new, quantitative, scientific, it doesn't matter, because people will hold close their own feelings and their biases. And I use that word feelings because we all gather information and create a artificial construct of what the world is like. But people, even in our profession, sometimes adhere awfully emotionally close to the individuals they're studying. All right. And then they become protective. And then when the evidence, whatever, they're not open-minded anymore. Some people, they're biased enough, they have confirmation bias, that whatever you're coming in, they have an emotional need to slap aside with far less nuance than you're actually bringing to the table. So outside of that, which is part and parcel of our profession, that's a given. The dangers is the access to Google and media and everything else, where somebody can look up one fact or think they have a fact, but you don't realize that fact is actually wrong. And then they can write a comment, anything, and they don't need to be an expert. They don't even have to sign their names anymore. It's not like you used to have a discussion with somebody who held different views and you would both grow by it, because that's the only reason we write. We write to engender discussion. But these are like guys who are looking for you to turn around so they can hit you in the back of the head with a weight. But then when you turn around to talk to them about it, they all run away because they don't have anything. So other than that, and I've got to find this here, because if I look down, there's a realization that I want to get this, that there is a mental health, the PTSD thing, for example, had 20 pages of very detailed diagnoses for it. All right, so first off, you have to have somebody, and that wasn't going to be me, be able to handle all that. But then the second part that's part of the DSM-5 is, it's called the Goldwater Rule. And the Goldwater Rule is because in the 1960s, 65, 64, I forget, a vast array, like 1,100 psychologists found Barry Goldwater, his lies and a lot of things he was saying, to be so potentially egregiously, stop me if any of this sounds familiar right now, egregiously bad for the nation, that they spoke out against him. All right. And they didn't have his permission. They hadn't had him in the room. And it became a watershed moment in the psychiatric industry, so that it becomes part of the DSM-5, where it's stated, and I'm trying to find the exact words here, prohibits APA members from offering professional opinions on individuals who were not examined. And there are professional punishments for doing so. Okay. I didn't want any of my students to get into that. But as a historian, I have my own personal copy of the DSM-5, and it's a big one, and it's really amazing, and it's depressing, and there, right there, that said there was an exception. The APA grants exceptions of historical figures if the psychology and the history are carefully examined. So the key word in that sentence, of course, is carefully, but and I'm telling you, because their professional careers as Army officers are on the line if they do this in a frivolous or non-professional manner. So we sat down and set out criteria. And that criteria, I had to follow it, they had to follow it, and anything that showed up in that chapter was agreed upon by all of them after they looked through it and edited. So we were very careful to handle that ethical consideration. That was key. The plan, and we had the plan, was to use firsthand accounts of Napoleon that were either his words or his words recorded. These aren't words of secondary, tertiary people. These aren't the words of historians. We were trying to get as close as we could to having him in the chair. That was key. The bias, then maybe I have a chance of, well, one, filtering out a lot of stuff, but also finding corroborating passages that are his words, right? If I find a single instance, it means nothing. But in the end, I found, and I was looking at things that related to human interaction, emotional tells, things that I thought and was kind of guided to, these are the things you want to look for. And I ended up finding 400 of them. Now, what they meant, I had no professional collective idea, because one of the things you did as an editor was said, how often is this, and you really helped me, how often has this been done in the past? And I went, I don't know, and I don't care. And then you said, you have to care.
That doesn't sound like me telling you what to do. I'm baffled by that, Ed.
But you must be right, because I didn't hurt you. So that's a good thing. But you always have good insight. So you made me go back and look it up. And I was shocked to find out that every instance in the past, I think but one current one, either these kinds of analyses of historical figures, psychological analyses, were done by historians without any connection to any mental health professionals. So they just sat down, we did in our professional wisdom, and just laid it on the table as how we saw it. Well, that's cockamamie. Because
I mean, let's put that in a different context. Would you, for example, want me as an expert in crime and punishment in the British Army during the 1900s to either sit as a judge on a case in the Supreme Court? Answer, no. Or B, would you like me to carry out your open heart surgery today, sir? Again, I suspect not. And that's the danger here, right? So for a lot of the time, I as a historian find myself correcting and stepping in to deal with people who think that because they've read an article online or because they've read a single book, they suddenly understand all about the history of the era. And so I end up having a lot of frustration trying to sort of push back against some of these sort of less than well-informed perceptions. And it's that same problem. You know, we are not trained to be psychologists. And this was what I respected about your work, that you had taken the time to bring on board the team who could do the psychological stuff, provided you could do the historian's work of going digging for the authentic material.
there was no other way to do it. But when you and I start looking at and find that without fail, most of them are written by historians, again, who didn't contact a military health professional, which means that book is useless. I'm sorry, it is. You can have insight, but you're not a mental health professional. So thanks for the evaluation. And then we found out that there were several done by psychiatrists, and you go, ooh, these are going to be great. And then you dig in, and they knew nothing about history. The most famous one, which I was told, oh, this is like the key study, the one in World War II on Hitler, right? And everybody says it's the golden, this is how it's done. And you find out that author used one Hitler biography, was dated, it was not particularly cited, and he ended up quoting Speer and all the people around Hitler more than Hitler, because Hitler's dead when they put the book together, right? So here's a psychologist who doesn't know anything about primary source material, and people are raving about his analysis of Hitler and his diagnosis, but you don't have the historical information.
But it's not like we're short of primary source material for Hitler, even if it's digging out Hitler's speeches, which, sure, they're not perfect because they're edited. Hello, there is Mein Kampf, for a start, which you could use as a source. Sure, it's been through an editing process, but it's closer to Hitler's words than, a biography. That's shocking.
So it was shocking to me too. And then I started looking at the other ones, and there was a recent one that looked at like Churchill, Hitler, Napoleon. There was a whole array. Now, it took us working very focused for 2 years to come up with this one thing on Napoleon. To do 9 historical individuals would have been, half of an academic lifetime. But it turns out it did. It only took him like a year because he had no citations. There was no guide to what he said, so you could go look it up, even for the psychiatric stuff.
The thought of a book without footnotes does make me twitch awfully. It's a nervous tick that as a historian I just can't get over. So I guess the big question is the sources that you use. What did you end up leaning upon? What was it that...
Yeah, let me hit one more thing, because everything we do, this is the big one, the expectation of weighing historical evidence, then I brought it in, I presented it. If it had no value, they threw it out. But what they did was corroborate it. I know that because I asked them. Here's an instance where he makes a nasty, snarky comment about one of his generals' plights. Okay, that's an isolated incident. Here's another one. Here's another one where he makes a nasty comment. Here's one where he takes Berthier, after the whole Berthier incident, where he's been longing for this woman for years and years to marry her. And Napoleon says, well, just, you're never going to get there, go off and marry her, this other woman. So Berthier marries the other woman within like 10 days. That woman he'd been chasing, her husband dies, and she would have been free. Does Napoleon have any empathy or try to, play the system and get his buddy out of that marriage? No, he brings him up in front of everybody and makes huge fun of his predicament. You come up with 50 of those, you have something. And that has been the kind of surprise with me. The sheer degree of professionalism on the part of these 5 students was nothing short of awesome. We just, their emails to me and back and forth to each other. You go, they're being as careful as possible. That doesn't mean that modern day Napoleon admirers they're not going to have the same care. And again, the problem with that is we use terms like, in the end, may care, possibly, he might have. They're all qualifiers. We're not claiming that after 200 years we know Napoleon. We're just claiming that here's some insight, corroborated comments by Napoleon assessed by mental health professionals. This might give us some insight. And to your question, I found out that if you called Gargon yeah, I'm sorry, I haven't slept much. My words are slipping. But if you look at some of these individuals who's, I want to make sure I get all the things right here. But if you look at their accounts, and then you want to describe, yes, we're going, who he was, because he's a general. He leaves to go with Napoleon, spend his whole time at St. Helena with him, the whole thing. If you call him a secretary, not in name, but by function, because all that poor general does is take down the bilious stuff, the volumes of it that Napoleon spews all the time. If you call him a secretary, that causes you, because he's not an official secretary, that causes his entire account to be thrown out. What do you say to that, right? I mean, so there's the huge danger. One, that you can't react to it is like you probably like to, because you're going, these are Napoleon's words. He's recorded them. Because you don't like the fact that I called him a secretary. So I'm just saying, any excuse, throw it out. Any excuse at all. And we know that you can look up a large autobiography, a large set of letters, and the guy gets fired later in his career. Well, he wrote a lot of this stuff way before that, all these letters from 20 years before. And he used to be a real fanboy. Okay, and then he'll throw something critical in, but he goes back to, you have to weigh that, and I should weigh that with some nuance, trying to gauge the time. Now, of course, the day after he gets fired or whatever, he's not going to be maybe as open. I got it. And that's just obvious. But I've been told I had to throw out all of them because these things that happen later in life. And then the argument has been, this is Bernier, say, well, he wrote the book in 1833 because he was broke and he was given X amount of money. So therefore the book has no value. We all write for money. We actually, historians don't.
Well, I was going to say, well, we try and write for money, but we don't necessarily succeed.
We don't
if you'd like to change that, the links to both Ed's book and the book that forms the crux of this talk, or rather there's a chapter within it that forms the crux of this talk, are in the descriptor. Please scroll back through, and if you are interested, then do avail yourself of a copy. Thank you very much in advance for your support.
Thanks for pimping that. That was nice. The idea that he wrote a book there for money, therefore negates it. And they said, well, he was doing this with a purpose. That's funny because when I dig in, the people who threw up the biggest were Bonapartists. What a shocker. Now, that is something I want the reader to know. And I put a little section in, letting them know up front. We were kind of stopped by word count for me doing 2,000 word biographies of everybody I cited. But the point of the danger is you as the historian have to know all these things in the background and try to present them honestly to your reader, because otherwise somebody's going to come out nowhere and tell you what you should and shouldn't use. But the whole point is all that stuff's corroborated. There's nothing we use. Like some of this stuff you'll look in here and go, there were 85 examples. I don't know how you could say that. Okay, if you want to throw his out, so no, there's 82. So that was a problem working with these folks. Once we had the ethics down, we tried to have the history down. That's any mistakes there are on me. Is weighing them independently so we don't get groupthink, and then bringing them out and having them examined so afterwards, so no, this is unprofessional behavior. There's a lot of things when you're trying to assess a historical personage that you have to really take into account. We tried to eliminate as much bias and as much secondary historian analysis. I don't need that. just let Napoleon talk, and boy, can he talk.
He certainly can. It comes back to the point that, sure, any historian is going to be open to critique, but at the same time, as one person, a rather wise individual once said to me, opinions are like backsides. Everybody has one. It's a question of how you choose to display it. And I will fully endorse people's rights to turn around and fundamentally disagree with anything that comes out of my mouth. But if you're going to do that, please have a premise behind it. If we're going to talk about historical stuff, otherwise you're not accusing me of being wrong. You're accusing me of incompetence, which is a very different thing. And we were, as you say, very meticulous in terms of how we went about this, to do this in an ethical way. And sure, as we're about to get to the nub of it, Napoleon does not come out of this smelling of roses. If you want to put Napoleon on a pedestal, do that. There's a case to be made for it. There's also a case to be made that you shouldn't do that. But if you're going to take issue with something purely on the basis that it's not nice about Napoleon, you do need to make sure that you're coming at this from an evidence base.
That's it.
And that's fundamentally the problem, I suspect, in some of the reaction to this. So the big reveal. Napoleon wasn't just a narcissist. He wasn't like your garden variety narcissist, a bit full of himself, arrogant. He had something called narcissistic, perhaps. The evidence would lead us to believe that he had something called Narcissistic Personality Disorder. What's the difference?
Well, we skip PTSS.
Okay, I was going to come back round to PTSS.
Well, I think we should start with it because that's what we started the research with. We were flabbergasted to find out, because there's two major criteria according to the DSM-5: directly experiencing traumatic events, witnessing in person the events as it occurred to him, and then a whole list of other criteria. Those are the only two that Napoleon qualified for. We were shocked. He seemed to exhibit only for those two standards out of 24. And that made us all stop and go, what is going on here? He's at war for 2 decades. He saw the deaths of millions of soldiers. For my guys, gals, and I have tons of respect for them, we were informed that about 20% of my students had PTSD. In the Army across the board is about 11 to 20%. By soldiers have just seen more action, more deployments. So if in a career we saw nowhere near the combat Napoleon had, if we have numbers that look like that, how in the world does Napoleon not have PTSD? In his times at St. Helena, he doesn't have, and I want to make sure I get this right, he doesn't have sleep disturbances. He doesn't exhibit, some angry outbursts, but if you walk down the list, he just doesn't have dreams, flashbacks, stimuli which cause him to go into immediate depression or isolation. He didn't have that. And we figured out why. He doesn't have any empathy.
None at all? He's completely incapable of it?
Let's just rarity of not showing up. Never mentions the men under his command, and 6 years dictating to various correspondents and secretaries at St. Helena. Doesn't mention them. Doesn't mention the officers except in a method to harshly critique them. He doesn't reminisce. He doesn't. I have soldiers to this day who will call me and cry when we start talking about things that they experience, and they know I can be trusted. They think I get it, and we have a good cathartic thing. And so how is that possible? The only person he cares for, and some Charles Blanc, Jean Charles, he only cared about himself. And if you only care about yourself, that frees you of all the things that would give you post-traumatic, because you don't have post-traumatic. It's done. It's just, and so That shocked us. So then in that investigation, they came to me because I don't know this stuff. Well, narcissistic personality disorder. Would you like us to investigate it? Yes, please. And so they did. They went through that diagnostic guide. And let me just read to you, and I think it's worth the audience knowing. Here are the criteria for this. Everybody's got some narcissism built in, every human being. But to get the narcissistic personality disorder, you have to qualify in 5 of 9 categories. Right? After I read these to you, the audience can run themselves through and see if they qualify, or their wives.
I've done this a couple of times, I must say. I don't qualify. I was mostly relieved of that. I think I probably hit 3.
Yeah, I did the same thing. I went, oh, baby. So, grandiosity, fantasies of unlimited success, believes he is immeasurably special, requires excessive admiration. That one turns out Napoleon does not. Psychologist disagrees. She said he got it in such a generous proportion. He got it all the time as a given that he doesn't mention it. But he doesn't. He doesn't mention needing excessive admiration. So it's 1 down for Napoleon, right? Has a sense of entitlement. He's interpersonally exploitive. Lacks empathy. Oh, yeah. He's envious of others. He's not, because he's the god, and he's arrogant. So people with narcissistic personality disorder have trouble handling anything they perceive as criticism. They become angry and impatient when they don't receive the treatment they think they deserve. They have interpersonal problems, are easily slighted. They will react with rage or contempt when challenged. They have difficulty regulating emotions and behavior. They have deep of shame, insecurity, and vulnerability, and often humiliation. So Napoleon qualifies on 7 of the 9 criteria, and then he exhibits 6 of 7 symptoms. That was the surprise to me. And we had so many examples. And narcissistic personality disorder in the hands of a commander is going to lead you to making choices like in Russia that a rational human being would never consider. Because, Caulaincourt just challenges Napoleon, saying, we're in these towns. Napoleon said there's going to be reinforcements. There's going to be food. He said, we already came through this town on the way through Poland. They didn't want anything to do with us. There's going to be nothing there. And Napoleon's going, no, we're going to get there. We're going to be able to turn around and take on these Cossacks. And there's nobody there. So it causes him to channel the variables, the real life variables, through his filter. We all do it to a degree, but if we're all starving and you tell me there's no food, that's one thing. But if we're all starving and the boss says, there's food here, and you're going, the boss, no, there's not. Then he's making irrational choices. So they were adamant. Of the 5 psychologists, 4 of them said he qualified under 7 categories. 1 of them said it was 8. That's pretty definitive.
That is an emphatic result right there. There's no denying that. And as you say, it wasn't as though you sort of found 3 out of your however many. What was it? 300?
400.
400. Apologies. Extracts that you used. You were also very careful. Once you used an extract once, you then couldn't use it in other categories.
That's correct.
So what this meant was that you sort of had 80 for one category and 70 for another, and then others where he didn't qualify, you sort of went, well, there isn't really anything that properly fit. There might be 1 or 2, but it's not very convincing. So we therefore discard that particular category. So there was a lot of very careful clinical work that went into this. It was quite it was almost sort of slightly mathematical in a sense, that kind of sense of, I have this body of material, and if this is going to be portioned off into category 1, I'm not going to reuse it. So I think those points perhaps get missed slightly when people sort of go, oh, I don't want to believe that he had narcissistic personality disorder. Having said that, when I speak to a lot of historians of the period and say, well, Napoleon seems to have had narcissistic personality disorder, they're not particularly surprised. There seem to be quite a few examples of his behavior over the course of his life that seem to lend themselves. Do you want to take us through a couple of highlights?
Well, I'll have to bring the book out and read from that if I need to, but part of the reason I think some of them aren't surprised is they have a vague understanding of narcissism, but they don't understand the 9 specific things that I read that constitute the actual disease. And the more you hone in, the more obvious it becomes, not the more vague. It becomes, I have so many of these, it's going to be hard to choose. And we got to then get to depression because there's more to it.
We'll get there. Okay. Don't worry.
Let me see. What nasty...
The audience is holding strong. I'm just liking the fact that you're dropping these little teasers. I mean, folks, we're also going to talk about traumatic brain injury. So buckle up, grab yourself a glass of wine.
Which one?
And the comfy slippers.
Which one would you like to me? I'll go to arrogant. How about that?
All right, then. We'll try arrogant.
I'll take arrogant.
Napoleon arrogant? Surely not.
I'll skip the siege of Jaffa when he killed the 1,200 prisoners because he wanted to. I mean, some of them were, they'd given their word and then they came back and fought. He just wasn't having that. That was rules of war. No, it's like the siege rules of war. You don't have to kill everybody in the fortress if you have to make a second assault. You might wreak havoc and steal and get drunk and do all that stuff, and maybe even some rapes and the occasional murder, but not many. But we'll just skip the fact that he thought he could just kill them all, and that was all right. Let me see. It turns out that gallantry to women was not his strong suit.
Again, you shock me.
To when he said at a large table of societal folks, and he says, heavens, how red your elbows are. That doesn't sound like much, but that's meant totally to embarrass that individual. He could have said anything, and he chose those words. And then he said, my, what an ugly headdress you're wearing. Why? Your dress is not even clean. Do you ever change your gown? I have seen you too many times. That's just arrogant behavior. And brings everybody together. Didn't like a intelligence report by Junot, and in front of everybody calls him an ass. He's a general. You gotta show respect. You want to call him an ass in private? That's when you do it. But he made sure that everybody was there watching, and called him an imbecile. Can you not read? There's only one reason you're doing that, is to elevate you and degrade him. You get nothing out of it. He's not a better commander he hasn't learned how to write better intel. He's just been demeaned.
Rachel Starks just popped up in the chat. Rachel, of course, is a regular contributor to the show through the Marshalls series, which is almost always something that goes out via the exclusive stream of episodes. So if you want more of those, you can subscribe on Spotify to the Napoleonic Wars podcast, or you can subscribe on Patreon to them. But Rachel makes the point, he was always so rude to many of the women of his court. Rachel, great to see you this evening. Thanks for that. Rachel is the knowledge, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to the women of Napoleon's court. So, he's consistent.
I appreciate her insight. Thank you, Rachel. I had 80 more examples of court nonsense to demean. I'll read you one more. He said, I have dictated 30 pages on the world's 3 religions, and I have read the Bible. My own opinion is made up. I do not think Jesus Christ ever existed. I believe in the Christian religion. If it dated, I would believe it if it dated from the beginning of the world. Socrates, Plato, and all these folks are, all the English should be damned. And Jesus was put to death like many other fanatics. And then he goes on to say that, he has understanding of prophets and messiahs from his vantage point there at the French throne. Somehow he, in world religion, and I don't care which religion you like or don't like, but to claim that you have, that he has wrestled with all these. And there's another part where it's just, he says when he's in France, he's like Catholic, and when he's in the Middle East, he's Muslim. And he said religions are all used to compel and coerce. Well, it may be true, but that probably shouldn't be your mantra. So I have, I don't know, you don't want to read, you don't want me reading, but he is just an individual who has exhibited these egregious behaviors towards others in such a standard way that it's part and parcel of who he is. I do not think that I would have liked being in the room with him. Just because if he's not coming after you, he's likely coming after someone else or telling you that he can, it's his ideas and he can conquer the world. And I should have personally exploited. Let me see, sense of entitlement. I'm trying to find. And God forbid if you ever brought something to his attention that was even a mild rebuke or caused him to better leader, better commander, that individual was going to pay, which means he's always limited in his growth. And people, oh no, I heard the most ridiculous things. He's the most welcoming, kind individual. It's like, what stuff have you read? Here's a good one. He said if he had stayed in Egypt, he should have become the emperor of the Orient. That's a bit grandiose. That's one of those grandiose things. He says some notions of predestination always affect my thought, but I never reject them.
It's the tag on. There's an interesting question that's just come in from Dave Hollins, actually. Evening, David. Do these features of narcissism increase over time? He seems to be a good internal analyst when younger, but then dismisses Juno later. So he's wondering, this is a point that Claire Civita made during the Waterloo Live stream for the Napoleonic and Revolutionary War Graves charity, that actually Napoleon seems to shift a bit in personality at different stages of his life. Did you pick up on that over the course of your research?
And that's the thing that we have to remember. It's hugely important, and I really like the question, in that we as human beings, if you do a bio of me right now, that's a snapshot in time. Was I like this at age 30? Will I be like this when I'm truly as old as dirt? You can't just sum up Napoleon writ large across his entire life with a description. What I noticed, and it's the narcissistic personality stuff, it grows on itself. It grows. By the end, he didn't seem to have anywhere near the same attitudes towards people that, of all people, Vergniaud, who was early on praising Napoleon for his insights and interaction and behavior. I think Napoleon always had high social intelligence, but what did he use it for? Did he use it for greater good? No, he used it for, again, more and more over time about things that benefited him or his driving idea. These got progressively worse because they're self-fueling. They're there. And now one of the criteria for this narcissistic personality disorder, you can't diagnose anybody under 18 with this. You're not allowed. But they have to be there from young adulthood in varying degrees. And so when you look at it, yeah, I can find them in varying degrees. He had a lot more humility, a lot more doubt early on. And then by the end, I find him somewhat almost delusional in his belief. So that's a great question. Yeah, I think he changes significantly over time.
Folks, keep those questions coming in. We will continue to answer them over the course of the live stream. And whilst you're reaching for the mouse and keyboard to post your comments, why not poke that like button while you're at it? It'll help the stream to grow and it will cost you nothing. It's just going to take a second out of your life. So please do whack that like button. You also might want to subscribe while you're here so that you can find your way back for future live streams. We're going to talk about treatment now, and then we're going to go on to traumatic brain injury.
Don't forget depression.
Oh, don't forget depression. He's not going to let me forget depression, is he? We will get to depression. Okay. I promise. I promise. So how do you treat Napoleon, or is it as simple as you can't? Because this is the thing with narcissism, not acute narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder, right? If you turn around to somebody who is narcissistic and you offer any kind of critique, it doesn't go well. And I speak from experience of trying to sort of gently prod ideas at narcissistic individuals that, maybe you need to consider a different perspective here. Maybe actually you're not quite the God's gift to whatever area you think you're God's gift to. And the response is not good. People turn around and go, oh no, I'm perfect. So how do you treat Napoleon?
I have a special section just for that. How do you treat?
That's kind of why I asked the question, if I'm being honest.
I know. Narcissistic personality disorder. How did you treat it then? You don't. Okay. How do you treat what we'll get to? TBI. It wasn't even recognized. You don't. How do you treat depression? They would have had various concoctions to try to get him to sleep. That's it. There's just not much in the psychological, recognition and treatment at the time. But I was told something really interesting by them. These students they were amazing, and I learned so much. And I was asking them about treatment for this because I had an inkling. Trust me, I had an inkling, especially given our current. I didn't even bring that up, wasn't I? Now I have to because I'm going to go back and bring it up. But the problem that was recent with the violation of the Goldwater Act was because there was a book written called The Dangerous Mind of Donald Trump. And 27 psychologists felt, this came out in 2017. They thought it was so, again, like before, this was so important that they were willing to put their careers on the line. So did all individual independent assessments. And okay, and then his niece is a psychiatrist, and she also diagnosed him also with antisocial personality disorder. And don't get me started on that. But I then asked the students naively, what treatment can you use? And they said, almost none. It would take intense therapy where this individual with grandiosity, feelings of being special, sense of entitlement, personally exploitive because he's really good at no empathy, arrogant. You got to get them into a room and get them to drop all those defensive shields to start. Then they said, everybody they know, they think they know because they don't get a lot of these patients. Because the patients if you'll listen to them, if you'll just, they'll regale you through every session endlessly. But as soon as you ask them a pointed question about, like, might you have behaved differently? He said, that'll be the last time you see them. So it makes treatment, at least they told me, really difficult. And I could see why, because a narcissistic personality disorder is not going to seek treatment. And then he or she won't stay.
Indeed, indeed. Okay, so we've teased folks a lot about this. No, I'm not going to get onto depression just yet. I'm going to keep you on tenterhooks for just a tiny bit longer. You can shake your fist at me as much as you like, my friend. It's not going to make a difference. Traumatic brain injury. Now, this is a really interesting one because this actually has implications for Brumaire, doesn't it?
I thought you jumped there for a minute. I thought I might have lost you.
No. So traumatic brain injury, this has implications for Brumaire, right?
It has huge implications. And the TBI being such a prevalent wound with current soldiers out in their vehicles and getting blown up. And I can't tell you how many soldiers I had who tell you they were blown up. And then you got to wonder cognitively, emotionally. I mean, it's a mess. It is a mess. I have to also admit that I was several years ago, but sitting when I had gone to an Air Force base, and I was sitting in traffic, and a guy in a van hit me about 50 miles an hour, full blast from behind. I was just sitting there. That wasn't so bad. It's when I had to stop when he drove me into the car in front of me. So I end up with TBI, right? They tested me. I had dropped about, on a scale of 100, 30 points of cognitive function, like overnight. Because I just happened to I had to brief General Petraeus on a big deal, and I thought that was kind of cool. And I didn't want to reach into a drawer, as I describe it, and that memory drawer is empty. Okay. And then the emotionality, I had memory loss. I had difficulties with emotions in my kids and things. And this was just from a car accident. And getting to know, this was in some ways the beginning of this, because this is what I do. I went and talked to the head neuroscientist at Ohio State and asked him about this stuff. And he says, you get 2 years. Your brain can heal itself in 2 years. But the degree with which the concussion, how often, I didn't even get knocked out. I almost got knocked out. I started to pass out, and I looked at the face of one of the pedestrians who was looking at me, and she was so horrified that I cycled my hockey sense. And I said, you're not hurt. You're not hurt. And so I made myself get out of the car and stumble up to check on the people in front of me. But if you get knocked out, there's varying degrees of concussions. You might never recover, right? And he told me of a gal who was a Ohio State hockey player who had 6 concussions while she played. And the chances of you getting the next one exponentially increases every time you have one. So they made her stop playing. And he told me, you've got 2 years, Ed, to get your marbles back. And then if not, you'll have to come up with coping things. And he asked me some interesting questions. In my case, the memory was there. The memory retrieval part, I had to kind of come back door thinking about the battle or the individual and think about John Elting, and then it would be there. So sometimes I would have to stall, like I'm doing right now. No, we're talk to the students about some interesting aspect while I'm trying to remember something. Fortunately, when I got back, I think I'd lost about 5% forever, but 5%. I know you're telling me I can't afford to lose 1%, but the idea that Napoleon, right? This is no joke stuff. You get knocked out, and you get knocked out for several hours. you are going to have some degree of TBI. It's just the way it is. The time he was knocked out the longest, which was for several hours, because his arrogance convinced him he could drive this coach with like six. Never ever driven a coach like that before with 6 horses. And then he comes to a corner and he can't quite manage the corner with the 6 horses, and he flips the wagon, and there he goes. Boom. He bounces and he knocks himself out. He doesn't come to, and then this is the part that I'm giving it away, but I've never seen a single discussion about, Napoleon. Everybody's amazed that at the coup of 18 Brumaire, he loses his ability to articulate. He just walks away and lets his brother handle all the business, right? It's because it was like 13 days after him having this major concussion. He had TBI. And I think knowing this kind of stuff gives you a greater insight into the events and the limitations and the struggles these individuals. We just think Napoleon lost his courage. Do we think he lost his cognitive capacity? Well, he did for a short time as he recovers from TBI. So he's carrying that around. There are individuals who will get TBI and be irascible for the rest of their lives. They will change. Okay, that frontal lobe stuff, they will change, and they never change back. So is it not a combination of all these factors we're looking at? He's got, which we'll eventually get to, depression, but he's got.
I might make you wait a little bit longer just because you raised it there.
No, it punished me like my old teacher, but he's got apparently an array of psychological issues. We're going to cause them total debilitating things, but in combination, they certainly had their effects. And then if you factor in TBI, the sleep disturbances with narcissistic personality disorder, you don't get sleep. That again causes cognitive and emotional, because you get in the TBI loop, the PTSD loop is you don't sleep, you fret, you think, you struggle, you don't sleep, your body releases cortisol, which again is the same hormone I mentioned before, which is the hormone for depression. That robs you of more sleep, and pretty soon you're down. Then you're into a real depressive state. I mean, actual clinically depressed. And that's what also they brought out. They thought that he had, and I'm throwing this in just because I want to, okay? They thought that there was a high likelihood that he had, we'll get back to, but I didn't ask him for this. This is the cool thing. This wasn't me. They said this anxiety and depression, and they were coming at it from different ways, but they all identified it as a real tell in his accounts. And so you put that in on top of this rest of the stuff. It's hard to function. We expect him to be this omniscient battlefield commander who never makes mistakes. And I think that's just very naive.
But there's an interesting point here, and I will finally cave and allow you to talk depression. Alleluia, he goes. But there is a point that's, we often praise Napoleon for his work ethic and his seeming ability to survive on what appears to be something like 4 hours sleep. You know, the famous thing that he sleeps from 12 till 2 at night, and then something like 5 till 7.
Yeah, gets a name.
And we go, wow, this is incredible. And yet you just made the point that actually attempting to survive on such little sleep could in itself have actually created problems for him. But I don't want you to say too much about this because we're going to do a separate live stream on it. But you got some interesting little teasers for us in relation to depression and his suicide attempts, haven't you?
I do. An individual with narcissistic personality disorder who believes he cannot fail and he cannot live in a paradigm, a construct of which failure on his part can be constituted. And then you throw in prolonged sleep deprivation, amongst some other things, which I won't review. But he's got propensities from a young man. And I don't know if he ever gets, just brought up, I don't know if he ever gets REM sleep or very little of it, because it takes you, 90 minutes to get into REM sleep? And that's like his entire sleep. I don't think, had he even somehow won Waterloo, let's ignore the military and geopolitical aspects. He was an old 46. His batteries were about done. I think emotionally, cognitively, I just don't see him being the same individual. And yet we evaluate him and his decisions at Waterloo as if he was at, it's 1805. And I think that's naive too.
Yeah, that's often been my big sort of complaint. And this isn't a Napoleon bashing comment, actually. For the point at which I often end up raising this is when people start doing the Wellington versus Napoleon discussion. They go, well, Wellington won Waterloo, so therefore that proves that Wellington was better. No, it doesn't. It absolutely emphatically does not, because that pretends that Napoleon at Waterloo is anything like the Napoleon that wins at Austerlitz, which is, you could almost have two different people commanding. That's how utterly vast the scale of difference is. Napoleon at Austerlitz is an utterly different animal. Napoleon at Austerlitz is closer to the Napoleon that wins in the Italian campaigns in the 1790s. The Napoleon at Waterloo is a similar breed to the Napoleon of the 1812 campaign. And that's the problem, fundamentally. The two are you're comparing almost chalk and cheese. Just because they're the same person doesn't mean that they are the same in terms of their ability. And I think you make a really important point here. We have got a comment. Weather and time beat Napoleon, not Wellington. Disagree with you there, Spartacus. There's a strategy at play. The weather affects everybody, so it affects the Prussians just as much as it affects Napoleon. So it means that Napoleon can't bring his troops up as quickly as he'd like, but it also means that the Prussians can't arrive as early as they would have liked. It is the Allied strategy of the Waterloo campaign that beats Napoleon, because the plan is to fight combined.
Time is something you have to manage. That's why the Army's always talking about, we seize the initiative, because that way your time frame is different than their time frame, your enemy's time frame, because they're busy worrying about you and the speed at which you're doing things, and they're most likely not going to notice and the mistakes and things you're making, because for them, you seem to be doing things. And again, even with the slightly increased regimental march rate and the decentralized command in Napoleon's army, that was all about managing time. So I never liked the comparisons anyway, because they get us nowhere, as we discussed on when Marcus and I had our great debate on those two. I don't think anything came of it.
Spartacus coming back in, but Wellington was positioned behind a hill and weather and time was his best friend. I think we need to do a live stream on Waterloo at some point, Spartacus. There is going to be an extended, very extended documentary on the Waterloo campaign as a whole, but there is a lot to unpick there. Being positioned behind a hill, that's just called taking up a defensive position. That's what you do in military history. Weather and time was his best friend. No, because it goes back to what we're saying earlier. It affects both of the allies in the sense that, sure, Napoleon doesn't have all of his troops.
But for Spartacus, this is the kind of thing we want to do, is to have these discussions and do it in a peer-to-peer way, weighing evidence, bringing things up. This is what inspires me. Looking down from a height and giving an edict, even, and I try not to do it either, because it doesn't get you anywhere. You want to, so I'll be on, but anyway.
Yeah, we will come back to that, Spartacus. I'm not shutting you down because I disagree. Well, I do disagree with your perspective and your arguments, but that's not to say that I'm sitting here going, you need to be quiet. You don't. it's a perspective. I disagree with it, and we will do a show on that in due course. In fact, there will be multiple, because, like I say, an extended, very extended documentary of the Waterloo campaign is coming to the channel over the course of the autumn, fundamentally.
Yay.
So make sure that you are subscribed to the channel.
Miss it.
So there you go.
So I think we're back to, let me finish depression, because we're talking about all these aspects that are weighing on him. I think in a heavier way, more and more impact on him. And now we're looking at him trying to manage Waterloo. He's a different cat. He'd almost have to be. But the idea that he had, that PTSD was behind it, makes perfect sense. Except it doesn't work out when you dig up. It's like, how could PTSD not? But he is depressed, long-standing sleep issues. Okay, and he describes them, the struggle of sleep. Now, we can admire that with the 3 to 4 hours, maybe when you're young, but he's not voluntarily sleeping 3 to 4 hours when he's older. That's all he can get and when he can get it. I'm not revealing how many times he tries to self-harm.
Yeah, no, you're going to save that.
I'm saving
partly
it.
because there's another edited collection coming out soon.
Oh,
and that will form a part. Well, I say soon. It will come out in time for September next year. It's in the editing stage, but I'm on it, people.
Yeah, good. I've got more. You gave me 2,000 more words, so.
Yeah, why was I so generous?
I don't know. You did the same.
That'll never catch on.
You gave me like a whole bunch, like 5,000. He's got mood disturbances. He's melancholy. He is what we would call clinically depressed often. All right. These are not my descriptors. These are the students that I hate to call them students because they're professionals, but they were my students. That's why I think of poor self-care. I mean, that is an indicator of how you take care of yourself. Chronic pain. Chronic pain often is also derived from chronic sleep deprivation. And so he's got that, and he's got instances beyond measure of volcanic explosive outbursts at people, because he is in such, I think, physical and emotional, he's like on edge, like so badly that anything that disturbs anything, he can't handle another variable. Now, he acts like he can because he's Napoleon, but down deep, he would just like to have some time and some generals that would sort things out for him so he could continue. But, he's not, by 1812 in Russia, he's a shadow of who he was. I don't know why knowing this doesn't give us a hint of more insight, rather than the folks who wanted to hear and say, no, he's our God throughout this war, and he's unchangeable. And that's, again, I put it was 2 years of this stuff with medical health professionals, and then you're fine editing and suggestions and looking things up. And I like science. I don't like opinion much.
Well, opinion is fine, provided it's based on fact, right?
But then it's not opinion anymore. Then it's
informed judgment.
That's right.
I guess it's a different entity entirely. We've had a question come in from Alan. Good to see you, Alan. Thanks for joining us throughout the live stream. Can we make any judgments about his capacity for empathy by examining feelings for his son / his siblings?
Yeah, that is insightful. You would think he would be all over losing connection to his son on St. Helena, right? He mentions it a few times. Then it's like, it's done, it's past, I can't do anything about it. He doesn't write about it frequently. Now, that might be an assessment on my part, but it doesn't come up. So how does it not come up every single day or every other day, or it doesn't come up? Could I see this? Could I see that again?
Yeah, of course. Alan Salazar, can we make any judgments about his capacity for empathy by examining his feelings for his son / his siblings?
because he only brings one of the siblings up. Is it Joseph? He only likes one of his brothers and sisters. He says so. He goes, I don't like the rest. And him only out of habit. What? And they don't come up either. When use the folks that fight for you, he feels they've taken advantage of him. He feels that they haven't contributed. And so he doesn't dwell on them almost at all. And I'm a firm believer that the absence of something is something. Uh-huh. If you don't bring up your son, you don't bring up the men under your command, the soldiers, you don't bring them up, that's because in your day-to-day life, they're not a significant factor. But Ellen, that is an excellent question. You would think that son be all over it.
Yeah, so what Ed's referring to there, for folks who aren't familiar with historian speak, because that is a phenomenon, it's known as reading sources against the grain. So you're not just going with the flow of the source, what does it say and what's the general mood and all the rest of it. You're actually looking at what happens when you look at things like the omissions, the underlying sentiments, what else is there besides the words themselves. And this is a skill that I think often gets missed when people sort of sit down and they go, oh, well, I disagree because I've got this source that says, and you have to sort of do a whole series of detective work to try and get to that. And as we've made clear, that's been the focus of
it was remiss. Sorry to interrupt you. You made me get me rolling here. I was remiss in mentioning that I searched all those primary source documents for things that ran counter to the ever accruing body of evidence. I looked for stuff that I would have thrown it in there. Mentions his son 7 times, loves him. I would have, because that's evidence. You just can't cherry pick your evidence. When you're talking about interpersonal reactions or relationships, you got to put all the positive stuff, and then the psychologist would have waited. But they weren't there. You put me at the end of a life, and I know I'm never getting off St. Helena, and I've got to be there, spend 6 years there. I'm going to reminisce something positive in my life. I'm going to miss them. I'm going to miss their laugh. I'm going to miss their proficiency. I'm going to miss their support. And it's just, he rails against everybody because you have that paradigm that he's failed within a construct that he can't fail in. And that's narcissism. And it's sad, but when he passed, he really didn't have a whole lot of connection to very many people.
We've had a few comments and questions come in, which I am just going to run through quickly. David Hollins, with empathy, did he not hang around after his early battle? So did he not see the casual? Sorry, I've misquoted David there. With empathy, he, i.e. Napoleon, did not hang around after his early battles, so he did not see the casualties. He's supposed to have slept for 48 hours after Aspern. Was he facing reality? There is a quote, I can't comment on whether or not it's apocryphal, but it is that very infamous one night in Paris will replace them all, which is consistent with the attitudes that Ed has uncovered, but I can't, off the top of my head, recall where it comes from to be able to say whether or not it is accurate. But Ed, let's get your thoughts on this.
I wish I had David and Alan and these folks in class, because I would throw the question back at them after having given them readings. I'd like to know what they think. That's how you get somewhere. I don't want to be the talking head. You could come up with the questions that have been posed today, then you can think, and I appreciate that. Do I think that he was there? Oh yeah, he was there. There's too many where he looks out over the sea of bodies and makes commentary that you went, what? That's not, because it's not what you would think would be the thing that would come out of your mouth with your own losses and the other losses. And I just don't, if it didn't affect him negatively, I don't think he cared. I mean, I think he has a 0 empathy quotient for whatever reason, as a human being, it's the only time I'm going to say anything for sure. It's not like I hate Napoleon, but I want you to know I don't love him either. These things are up here, including my Napoleon behind me. They're here because it was through the examination of Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars that I discovered so many things about history. So that he has been my portal initially. So my students loved it too. They were always buying me extra stuff. And just so you know, the medals up here on Napoleon are authentic, because you got to know, they're authentic.
So for those who either can't see closely enough or who are listening to this on catch up on the podcast, Ed has a Napoleon dynamite in the corner behind his desk, and pinned to the chest is a Légion d'honneur, which is a deeply impressive thing indeed. Carry on, Ed.
He is an oversized, I wish I had been this size, 6'1" mannequin, because all male mannequins are 6'1" over here. You can't buy one different size. So he's large. I found a coat. I got the uniform, and he was what greeted you when you came into my office, when you walked down the hallway. Why not?
That gives you a good insight into Ed's teaching style. If you walked into my classroom when I was a teacher, you'd have just found far too much minion stuff clustered in various locations, which again gives you far too good an indication into my teaching style. Dillard Lester asked, is there an argument to be made that some of these issues added to or maybe caused his success? That's a good question. I like that, because you can make the point that if somebody thinks if they have that sense of entitlement, that they are destined for greatness, they have no limits. There's no boundaries.
I think absolutely, because we forget an extraordinary and an intellect to be able to, as I discovered with some soldiers, some people can just see maps and the ramifications just by looking at them. They don't need a full array of stuff. They'll go, the choke point is right there. And he was that guy. He had so many skills. Let's not act like he couldn't win over subordinates. Now, the little ear tug and all the medals, but let's think about this. You get the Légion d'honneur, you get a full pension for life, right? He had soldier homes, he had medical care for soldiers, but he doesn't have to pay on any of that stuff if they die. So I think it's more of like it wins them, it keeps them motivated, and he's going to reward brave behavior, et cetera, et cetera. So he's got a whole array of social intelligence, his own intelligence, his ability to use combined arms, decentralize. He's got all that stuff. And then if you make him, have you ever stood next to somebody who's absolutely in a kind of scary situation? You go with them because he's got a plan. He's damn certain of it. And you go, okay, so he's got that going for him. And then he wins. If he was, I think I figured out once, he was 43-7 in all his conflicts. If he had been 22-25, it would have been another thing entirely, or whatever the numbers come out to be. So he's hugely successful. He's got all these traits, believes he's special. I mean, he's got things that would drive. Did he have doubt? No, which is bad if you want a rational thought. But if you just want a driven soul, then, he's arrogant. He believes. I mean, I never did this with kids. Don't tell them we're going to go out there and kill them. Don't tell kids that, because it may or may not be true. And they know when you're trying to yak them around. How about talk about some things that are technical that they need to do? Don't talk about winning. Talk about the details you need to win. And I think Napoleon had both. I think he gave them a sense of, because I'm a soldier on a battlefield. If I'm French, I know I'm going to likely survive because we win and casualties come when we lose. And I'm going to get a chance to plunder, right? I'm going to get rewards. And even you look at Michael Hughes's wonderful book, he's going to get a chance probably to know the women of Europe and have the French jurisprudence system kind of go, yeah, go ahead. Things like that. All these narcissistic traits, some of them, fantasies of unlimited success. But at what point do they become delusional? At what point do they start becoming a detraction? How about the time where he uses such a huge proportion of the men and officers that he won with in 1805? He's used them all up through his continuous campaigns based on his ego and things. Now you're not going to be quite so 24-0-ish. Now your arrogance can actually failure. Wouldn't you agree to some point, Zach?
Sorry, you are dropping in and out a little bit, Ed.
Wouldn't you agree a little bit to that?
What I think you tap into a few really important points here. One of the significant things is, yes, the continuation to fight. Another is the consideration that we haven't touched on here, which is let's forget about the military angle for a minute and consider the diplomatic. Because I have always said time and again that Napoleon is a hugely successful battlefield commander. He knows how to win the war, but doesn't really know how to win the peace. My argument being there that because he is so accustomed to extracting so much, he actually insists on extracting so much. Because he's won so emphatically, he doesn't have that awareness. And perhaps this is a reflection of him as fundamentally a battlefield commander more than anything else. He doesn't have that awareness that sometimes you don't dictate all the terms. You don't extract everything that you possibly can from your enemy. And that in turn breeds resentment. Now, in a situation where you have a guy who believes that he is predestined to greatness, who is unaccustomed to boundaries, who believes that his own will is the way that the world needs to work, that's hugely problematic in a diplomatic context, right? Because he's going to insist on everything. He's going to extract everything. And that fundamentally for me is Napoleon's undoing. He asks too much too many times.
So it's another fine question that we've had, and I usually don't praise questions this much because it's kind of, rote, except these questions have all caused me to think about something I've already spent a lot of time thinking about. And I think that's a fair assessment. He's going to run out of gas emotionally, logistically. I think there's a lot of things he was never going to. He couldn't sustain this, and he wasn't even sustaining it when they were fighting at the end.
Mark Trowbridge comes in with a curious thought. Perhaps the ultimate indicator of his disorder was making the decision to return in 1815. Personally, I'd agree with you there, Mark. I think that's a powerful argument to make. For me, very much the 1815 is about Napoleon looking after Napoleon, as opposed to thinking about bigger picture and the implications of his return, because the man is not a fool by any stretch of the imagination. Anyone who wants to make out Napoleon is dumb has fundamentally misunderstood the guy. And I personally think he must have known that his return would lead to war. The idea that the Allies have taken the time to defeat him categorically after he's rejected those peace terms so many times, and then he's just going to come back and they're going to sit there and go, yeah, that's fine, you stay as Emperor of France. We're just going to quietly ignore that.
But he was
naive in the
he was
extreme.
Incapable of staying on that island. His ego, his whole absolutely incapable of, because it made him. Now remember, where does he want to go after Waterloo? He wants to go to America, right? Had he asked to go to America before Waterloo, they might have let him do it. Get him out of here, go. But he can't. He cannot be secondary to anybody. He can't have terms dictated to him by anybody. He must, I think the way you said extract, he must extract what he wants. So did he care that the French mothers had given how many sons and what call up year he was going to have to bring in? He didn't. Well, if you don't have empathy, though, it sure frees you.
Certainly does. We've got a last question here from Geraint, which is more a sort of call for future research, I think, than anything else. How does Napoleon as a personality compare to other commanders and leaders, such as Alexander, that's Tsar Alexander, Wellington, and Archduke Charles, etc.? I'm going to preempt Ed by saying that it took 2 years to get Napoleon sorted in Ed's research. I think we're going to need another 10 to sort out. Probably need another 3 just for Wellington, quite frankly, because boy, could you make a very quick sort of back of a cigarette packet case for Wellington as a narcissist. You can find some research to support that pretty quickly. But I think a lot more needs to be done before you can make a definitive case on that one.
I wish we had time. I wish I had time in my life, but there's probably not enough firsthand words of Alexander or things he dictated to compile anything. So it'd be all that kind of bad psychological analysis of history that, so you don't have enough evidence. You're making guesses. I don't think that's helpful. But do I think there may be some similarities in there? The egotism, the grandiosity, and all that stuff. Yeah, I do. But that's just a guess at this point. You know how I feel about Wellington. And
not a fan, apparently.
He would not be hard, but we would face the same kinds of pushback. Assess it because he's a national hero. I suppose it would be the same if we did something with George Washington over here, I assume. But George Washington is the one that turned down the kingship. There's parts of Wellington that I find equally disturbing. And I think we praise him because in the end he won. But I'm not a big... I think we could do it easily because all his volumes of correspondence. And yeah, I think without a doubt, I could... He's grandiose, believes he's special, sense of entitlement, personally exploitive. Where's he? Yeah. Can I walk down the list? Lacks empathy, arrogant.
Yes.
Yeah. So
yeah, I mean, you could easily hit 4 of those straight away. Some of the others I would waver ever so slightly, but I think he's close, if nothing else. He's certainly close.
The question implies, and it's justifiably, that maybe if we had the capacity, then they would be done right, not shooting star stuff where somebody just makes an assessment without the evidence of the skill set. But it'd be interesting to know how many military commanders over time fit a great deal of these characteristics. And it is that part and parcel of what brings them in, or does it in fact make them successful? Can you step on people and not worry about lack of empathy? In the Army, we would talk about which of these play into toxic leadership. That's intriguing. That gets to be interesting. So the question has merit, but I sure as can do it. This has been exhausting in a good way. And it was so interesting at first. And then it was so interesting as we discovered things and wrote them up. But then the care that you have to take to make so many other people, usually I just let the evidence speak for itself. But in this case, that hasn't mattered. And
it's a thing of horses and water, isn't it? And I see this a lot actually on the channel, sort of people thinking that because they've got a certain idea in their head, they therefore have the only perspective that can and should be heard. Ed, it's been fantastic to talk to you. Folks, a reminder, if you want to buy Ed's book on the British soldier under Wellington, it's called All for the King's Shilling. That's All for the King's Shilling, the British soldier under Wellington. It was published by Oklahoma University Press in 2010. It is available to order on Amazon. Or if you're not a fan of giving Jeff Bezos your custom, you can, of course, go direct to the publisher. Check out the Oklahoma University Press website for more details. If you would like the book which contains the chapter upon which tonight's talk has been based, it is called The Sword and the Spirit. That is The Sword and the Spirit. It's the proceedings of the First War and Peace in the Age of Napoleon conference. It was published by Hellion, and you can get that online, again, via Amazon, or if you feel the mood, go direct to the publisher, hellion.co.uk.
Good editor. Good editor.
I think the jury is out on the quality of the editing, but we'll save that discussion for another day. Folks, if you've enjoyed tonight's session, firstly, please whack that like button. It's an indication that actually, yeah, you quite enjoyed this. That helps a lot. If you want to find your way back, because there will be more interesting talks like these, then the subscribe button is your friend. So you'll get notifications when new videos go up. And there's going to be a lot coming out over the course of the autumn. This channel is massively ramping up. There is also an entire podcast built. It's actually what this show extends from. It's called the Napoleonic Wars Pod, and you can get it wherever you get your podcasts. It's literally everywhere. It has about 200 episodes for you to enjoy, so there's quite a hefty back catalogue. If you are so fascinated by this period that you need to immerse yourself into an entire Napoleonic Wars Pod world, or you just want to support the production of content like this because it takes time and money and effort and many other things, then please feel free to avail yourself of the opportunity to support your host. That's me. The options are on your screen now, so you can leave one-off tips via Ko-fi. That's ko-fi.com/Napoleonicist. Or if you want to become a regular supporter, you can go to patreon.com/Napoleonic Wars Pod for details on all kinds of tiers and different perks within them. So it starts at £1 a month, goes up to a heck of a lot more than that. If you want to save yourself 5%, then you can take out the annual membership option. And you get perks ranging from exclusive episodes through to shout outs, monthly socials, the opportunity to request episodes, green room access. So actually some of the patrons have been sitting behind the scenes of this very show, and they will get the chance to sit down with my guest afterwards and chat and ask their questions directly. And there's even a course that you can join up if you are interested. So lots for you to have a little look into if you're keen. Thank you as ever for your time. A massive thank you to Dr. Ed Coss, Emeritus Professor at the United States Command and General Staff College, for your time this evening. I've been your host, Dr. Zach White. This has been the Napoleonic Wars channel. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe. And as always, thank you